On a sweltering August night in 1969, a crew of drifters from a sun-scorched ranch crept up a private drive in the Hollywood Hills, their headlights off and their intentions unspeakable. It was a song, a gentle melodic tune written by the most famous band in America, that had already sealed their fate. The world knew the Beach Boys as the grinning apostles of summer, but one of them had made a deal with a devil who wore a prophet's smile, and the fallout would nearly destroy them all. How does a family band built on surf harmonies become entangled with the most infamous cult leader of the century? And what happened to the song that started it all? The Beach Boys were the sun-bleached smile of America, the clean-cut sound of endless summer and innocent harmony. Yet one of their own quietly opened the door to a wandering singer who had become the most infamous killer in the history of rock and roll. Which member of the Golden Group let a monster sleep in his own bed, eat his food and borrow his car? The answer is far darker than the myth of a doomed friendship, and the secret he carried would follow him to his watery grave. By the summer of 1968, Dennis Wilson was living the exact life his music had promised. He was the drummer for the Beach Boys, the golden-haired prince of a band that had soundtracked the American dream, and his sprawling mansion in Pacific Palisades was the kind of place where the California sun seemed to shine a little brighter. He was the heir to a carefree empire of surf, sand and harmony, a man who had everything a person could want. So when he spotted two teenage girls hitchhiking along the Pacific Coast Highway one afternoon in May, he didn't think twice about pulling over. He was naturally generous, open-hearted, always ready to help a stranger, and the girls were charming and grateful. They told him they were looking for a place to stay, and they knew a man who could help them. That man, they said, was a spiritual leader, a gifted musician who lived in a small house on Santa Monica Boulevard in Venice. Manson was waiting for him in a tiny cluttered room at 20 Women 28 Santa Monica Boulevard, surrounded by a handful of young women who regarded him with total devotion. He played guitar for his famous guest, sang him a few songs, and Dennis was transfixed by the strange hypnotic quality of the man's presence. Within days, Manson and around 15 to 20 of his followers had packed their belongings and moved into Dennis's mansion at 14400 Sunset Boulevard. They ate his food, used his cars, slept in his beds and recorded music in his studio, all without paying a cent. But a strange unease began to settle over the estate as the months wore on. The police records from the end of 1968 paint a picture of chaos that even Dennis could not fully control. The Manson family turned his home into a base of operations for their increasingly erratic behavior, hosting group orgies and experimenting heavily with drugs, and the neighbors were so alarmed that they called the Los Angeles Police Department on multiple occasions. Each time, Dennis smoothed things over, convincing the officers that it was all just a bit of harmless fun, that he could handle his new friends and there was no need for anyone to worry. He refused to see the danger signs, brushing off the concerns of his bandmates and his record label, insisting that Manson was a misunderstood genius who simply needed a chance. And Manson, for his part, kept singing his strange, dark songs late into the night, his voice echoing through the canyon, filling the house with a sound that should have been a warning. How do you explain the moment when you realize the guest you welcomed into your home has become the thing that will haunt you for the rest of your life? What exactly does it take for a man to stop making excuses and start paying attention? If you ever come across a shocking story about a celebrity's brush with infamy, there is a method to sorting fact from hysteria. First, trace the claim back to its earliest known source. Second, look for at least 2 independent accounts that corroborate the same details. Third, search for legal documents such as police reports or court records. Fourth, check the dates, the known timeline of events to spot any impossible gaps. And fifth, compare your findings with academic databases that archive primary source material. The night before Dennis finally asked them all to leave, Manson sat on the living room floor with a guitar resting on his knee, and when he looked up at Dennis, there was a coldness in his eyes that the drummer had never noticed before. The song was never supposed to leave that house. Charles Manson had written it himself, a slow and creeping thing called Cease to Exist, and he had recorded it right there in Dennis Wilson's home, filling the bright California rooms with something that felt far older and darker than the pop music Dennis made. He simply released it into the world as if it had always been his. Manson did not take the theft quietly, and the confrontation that followed has become the stuff of rock and roll legend. The moment the golden boy of the Beach Boys stared down the barrel of a gun. According to Dennis's own account, Manson arrived at the house in a cold fury, the gentle guru act gone completely, and he made his point with a weapon drawn. The words hung there in the Pacific Palisades air, and Dennis, the man who had let 15 strangers live in his home and eat his food and drive his cars, finally understood that he had invited something truly monstrous into his life. The recording session for the track, which took place on the 29th of October 1968, had been strange from the very beginning. Manson hovered around the edges of the studio, watching Dennis and the band work, occasionally offering suggestions in that low hypnotic voice of his, and the whole thing felt less like a collaboration and more like a ritual. When the record finally came out, the original version of the song, with its chilling refrain of "Cease to Exist, Come On and Die," was still buried somewhere in the master tapes, a sinister ghost haunting the sunny single. Music critics have since called it one of the most unsettling tracks ever released by a major band, a hidden threat disguised as a love song. But it was the aftermath that truly revealed the depths of the danger Dennis was in. For years, collectors have hunted for the original vinyl, and a pristine copy of that record now fetches upwards of $2,000, not because the music is brilliant, but because it represents the precise moment when the 60s dream curdled into something rotten. The first step is identifying exactly who wrote the original material. The second is checking the release history for any legal disputes. The third is hunting down alternative recordings to see what was left on the cutting room floor. The fourth is examining the context surrounding the recording. And the fifth is considering the real-world consequences that followed. The story of Never Learn Not to Love checks every single box. Dennis had been naive, dangerously so, and now he was trapped in a web of manipulation that he could not begin to understand. The gilded cage of 14400 Sunset Boulevard had become a prison, and the only way out was to walk away from the very thing he had built. They rolled out of Los Angeles and cut through the desert states, a caravan of runaways, and lost girls living off the drummer's credit, moving from one dusty stop to another, as if testing the boundaries of how far his generosity could stretch. By August of 1968, they had settled into Spahn Ranch, a decaying movie set, tucked into the hills northwest of the city, where the old western facades rotted under the California sun, and the silence felt heavier than the smog they left behind. It was here, among the abandoned hitching posts and crumbling saloon fronts, that the family began to train in earnest, practicing knife attacks on dummies and mapping out the chaos that would define the next year of their lives. The ranch became their fortress, and the law took notice long before the bloodshed. On the 16th of August 1969, police raided the property and arrested Manson and several followers on suspicion of auto theft, only to release them hours later because the evidence fell apart under scrutiny. That brief window of freedom, granted by a technicality, allowed the group to slip back into the hills and continue their preparation without interruption. The LAPD files from that summer show a pattern of complaints from neighbours and ranch hands alike, but no one connected the dots until it was far too late. How many warnings had to pile up before someone realised the danger was not just a band of hippies, but a cult leader sharpening his followers into weapons? The money drained out of Dennis Wilson's accounts at a staggering rate, roughly $200,000 between 1968 and 1969, spent on cash handouts, organic groceries from health food stores, and a brand new car that the family would later use in the LaBianca murders. Jeff Gwynne, in his biography of Manson, traced that spending with chilling precision, showing how the drummer funded the very machinery that would turn against him. The same man who had welcomed strangers into his home with open arms was now bankrolling a movement he barely understood, and the irony was lost on no one except Dennis himself, who kept writing checks because stopping meant admitting he had been played for a fool. On the 6th of December 1968, Terry Melcher, the record producer who had once lived in the house where Sharon Tate would later die, sat in his studio and listened to Manson sing his songs of apocalypse and love. Melcher turned him down flat, no album deal, no second chance, and that rejection lit a fuse that would burn for 9 months until it reached CeeLo Drive. The producer, the son of Doris Day, had no idea that his refusal had marked him as the enemy in Manson's fractured mind, nor that the address he had abandoned would become the site of the slaughter meant to punish him. Do you see how the strands twist together? How one polite dismissal in a recording studio set the stage for the worst massacre in Hollywood history? If you want to trace how such stories become distorted over time, start by identifying the court that held jurisdiction over the original trial. Then pull the case files through PACER, the federal system that keeps public records accessible online. University libraries often house microfilms of the full proceedings that never made it into the papers, and those transcripts reveal details the headlines chose to bury. Cross-reference those documents against historical newspaper coverage from the period, and you will find the gaps where legend replaced fact. That method, built on the National Archives and Records Administration's guidelines, turns any curious reader into a proper investigator. But here is the question that should keep you up at night as the ranch gates close and the family circles back toward the city. How close did Terry Melcher come to dying in that house? And what does that narrow miss say about the cruelty of the man who sent his followers down the hill that night? By the time the summer of 1969 arrived, the man who had once opened his home so freely had become a prisoner of his own generosity. The phone call came at 8:30 in the morning, a strange voice on the line saying how sorry he was about the previous night, how he hadn't meant for Dennis to be there, how he had only been aiming for Terry Melcher. Dennis laughed it off as a prank, but then he switched on the television, and the laughter died in his throat. The news reports were already flashing images of a house he knew well, a rented estate at 1050 Cielo Drive, where 5 people had been brutally murdered just hours earlier. Terry Melcher had once lived there, and Charles Manson had sent his followers to that address, still believing his old producer remained inside. The blood belonged to Sharon Tate, the wife of Roman Polanski, along with 3 of her friends, and an 18-year-old boy named Stephen Parent, who had only been visiting the caretaker that night and had never once crossed paths with Charles Manson. Parent was an innocent, a kid who simply happened to be standing in the wrong driveway at the wrong moment, and his death served no purpose other than to seal a mistake. But the mistake had been born months earlier, when Dennis had normalised the danger living under his own roof, when he had laughed off the guns and the threats and the talk of race wars as eccentricity. He had let 15 or 20 strangers eat his food, drive his cars, and use his studio, telling himself they made him feel useful, and never once asking the question that should have stopped everything. What kind of man collects followers and calls himself their saviour, and what does he plan to do with them once his songs are rejected? The answer arrived in that morning phone call, and it arrived in the faces of 5 dead people who had never known Dennis Wilson's name. Terry Melcher had made an enemy of Manson simply by refusing to produce his album, and when he quietly moved out of Cielo Drive, nobody thought to tell the man who was still plotting his revenge. But Dennis was haunted differently, because he had been the bridge, the one who invited the monster into the world of music and fame. He had watched Manson charm Hollywood elites at his parties, watched him preach conspiracy theories to people who should have known better, and he had done nothing except enjoy the feeling of being needed. The question that followed him into every sleepless night was simple and unbearable. If he had never picked up those 2 hitchhikers on the Pacific Coast Highway, would 5 people still be alive today? He was summoned before the Los Angeles County Grand Jury to testify about his relationship with Charles Manson, and the cult leader's lawyers fought to put him on the defense witness list. Dennis would later describe the entire ordeal as hell on earth, a gauntlet of suspicion and legal manoeuvring where he was treated less like a witness and more like an accomplice. The band's response was swift and total. The Beach Boys imposed a blanket ban on any member or staffer speaking to the press about Manson, and Capitol Records moved to purge every song remotely connected to the cult from future pressings. Never Learn Not to Love disappeared from circulation entirely, a haunted artifact that no label wanted to touch. But scrubbing the records could not scrub the stain. When the label rushed out the album Sunflower in 1970 to rehabilitate the band's image, it failed spectacularly, with sales dropping by roughly 1/3. The Harmony group that had once embodied the California dream now carried a shadow that no amount of sunshine could burn away. They said they exploited his loneliness and his desperate need for acceptance, a need that his own family had never quite fulfilled. The tragedy was not just that he had been deceived, it was that the deception worked because he was so alone. When the trial finally ended, the damage was already internalized. Dennis checked into a California rehab facility in 1971, his second stint, and the doctors noted severe anxiety tied directly to the Manson trauma, even though he never received an official diagnosis. He began drinking heavily, and the brothers who had once harmonized together drifted into silence. Brian Wilson, the band's creative genius, withdrew further into himself, and Dennis later confessed that Brian would never look him in the eye again. The psychological weight of knowing he had financed and sheltered the men who committed the most infamous murders of the century was crushing him. He was convinced that Manson could order his death from inside prison, and that fear never truly left him. Ask yourself this: what does it do to a man's soul when he realizes that his own kindness, his own open door, helped arm a killer? Dennis Wilson would spend the rest of his life trying to answer that question, and he would never find a version of the answer that set him free. Months before his death, Dennis Wilson heard a story that should have chilled him more than it did. Yet the deeper truth was that Manson never needed to invent a rescue to own Dennis, because Dennis had already handed over the keys himself. Still, he let the family eat from his fridge, sleep in his beds, and drive his cars, confessing once that they made him feel useful in a way his own bandmates never did. It was that loneliness, that desperate hunger for purpose, that Manson read like an open book and exploited without mercy. Patricia Krenwinkel, only 21 when she met Manson at Dennis's house, became one of his most devoted followers. She took part in both the Tate and LaBianca killings, and when asked at trial why she did it, she answered that Manson had rescued her from a dull suburban life in Alabama. But Dennis never saw himself as a bridge. He saw himself as a man who had made a terrible mistake, and he told a reporter before his death, "Manson is a devil, but a devil I created myself. If I had not let him in, he might never have had a base to kill those people." He drowned on December 28, 1983, after diving into the ocean at Marina del Rey to retrieve keepsakes he had thrown into the water following a breakup, and friends said he never truly got over the Manson shock. Music historians note that the relationship itself lasted less than 9 months, yet its shadow stretched across 5 decades, outliving the band's clean-cut image and even Dennis himself. When you examine a song like Never Learn Not to Love, you have to trace its origin, check its release history, hunt for alternate recordings, and weigh what came after, which is exactly how you separate a cursed record from an ordinary one. But no 5-step verification can measure the weight Dennis carried, because the real curse was never in the music at all. It was in the man who wrote it, and the hollow space inside a drummer who just wanted to be needed. The question that opened this story was whether you would have recognized the stranger in the Mirror magazine, that he had no idea how serious the bond between his brother and Manson had become until the case exploded, confessing he could not believe Dennis would bring such a dangerous man into his home. That disbelief was the shared property of an entire nation that had once seen only sunshine in their music. He understood perhaps too clearly that his loneliness had made him prey, a truth as brutal as any chord the band ever played. The gentle heir to the California dream had opened his door to a nightmare, and the echo of that decision never faded. So ask yourself, sitting there in your own quiet safety, would you have seen the danger before it was too late? Would you have let him in? But in the summer of 1968, on a stretch of Pacific Coast Highway, that dream began to curdle. He picked up 2 hitchhiking girls, and they didn't just want a ride. They led him to a man whose gaze felt like a trap closing, a man named Charles Manson, who would soon move his entire family into Dennis's own home at 14400 Sunset Boulevard. For months, Dennis paid for everything, letting a dozen or more strangers eat his food, drive his cars, and use his recording studio, all while Manson preached his twisted gospel to the young women and Hollywood hangers-on who drifted through the mansion. The parties grew darker, the sex more casual, the drug use more brazen, and the neighbors' complaints to the police became a regular nuisance that Dennis would quietly smooth over, always afraid of the scene he had allowed to fester in his own living room. He was not just a victim of circumstance. He was a willing host to a nightmare he refused to name, blinded by a desperate need to feel important to someone, anyone, and that blindness would cost him more than he could ever imagine. This is the story of how a rock and roll prince handed his kingdom to a devil and then watched it burn. Dennis Wilson's awakening did not come as a sudden thunderclap, but as a slow creeping dread that settled into his bones like the damp fog rolling off the Pacific. By the time the summer of 1968 bled into autumn, the laughter that once filled the mansion had taken on a shrill, almost manic quality. One night he stumbled into the kitchen half asleep in his silk robe and found, not a casual snack thief, but a young woman, barely more than a teenager, sitting cross-legged on the counter, meticulously carving an X into her own forearm with a rusted safety pin. Her lips moved in a silent mantra, and the blood beaded up in perfect crimson rows down her pale skin. Dennis froze, his stomach lurching, a cold sweat breaking out at the nape of his neck. He wanted to scream, to rip the pin from her hand, but the girl looked up at him with a serene, knowing smile that made his skin crawl, and she whispered, "Charlie said we have to be clean inside and out." He backed out of the room without saying a word, his own cowardice tasting like bile in the back of his throat. That night he did not go back inside the house. Instead he sat by his pool, the water shimmering with the reflection of a half moon, a bottle of scotch growing warm in his trembling hands, watching the windows of his own home flicker with candlelight, a house he no longer recognized, filled with people he did not know, all orbiting around a gravity he could not escape. The breaking point arrived with a knocking on his door that did not stop, a frantic, rhythmic pounding that clawed at the stillness of 4 in the morning. Dennis, his head throbbing from a cocktail of quaaludes and cheap wine, yanked the door open to find a man he vaguely recognized from the Studio City scene, a session guitarist with a wife and a baby on the way, standing there with a face the color of a wet paper bag. The man's eyes were wide, bloodshot, and he was shaking so violently that his teeth chattered. "They told me Charlie would fix me, but they're in my head, Dennis. In my head, telling me to do things." His hands, slick with sweat, grabbed Dennis by the bare shoulders, the grip leaving hot moist marks on his skin. "Things to my baby, man. They want me to hurt my baby." Dennis could smell the rancid odor of fear and stale alcohol emanating from the man's pores, and for a split second he saw his own reflection in the visitor's terrified eyes. A man who had traded his own chaos for a manufactured, communal madness, and in doing so had lost all authority to comfort another soul. He gave the man a glass of water he didn't drink, a pat on the back that felt like a lie, and sent him out into the pre-dawn gloom with a mumbled assurance that Charlie's not that bad, man. He's just intense. The man walked away, his shoulders slumped, his footsteps dragging on the gravel, and Dennis closed the door, leaning his forehead against the heavy wood, feeling his heart hammering against his ribs. He was lying to himself, and he knew it. His brother Brian, who rarely left the safety of his own home anymore, caught wind of the situation through a frightened phone call from a mutual acquaintance. Brian's voice on the line was thin, reedy, full of that familiar, almost prophetic anxiety that had driven him to the sandbox in his backyard for comfort. "Dennis, you have to get them out," Brian pleaded, his speech slurring slightly from the medication his doctor had prescribed. "I had a dream. They're going to hurt you, hurt us all. This Charlie guy, he's not a musician, that's not music." Dennis gripped the receiver, the plastic slick in his hand, and could almost feel his brother's trembling energy vibrating through the phone line. He wanted to confess that he hadn't written a single lick of usable melody in months, that his own drumsticks felt alien in his calloused hands, that the only sound he could produce was the frantic, nervous tapping of his fingers on the armrest of his sofa, which was now stained with wine and cigarette burns from strangers who claimed to be artists. "It's just a bunch of chicks who dig me, man. Free love, you know how it is." The silence on the other end was deafening. "I know you're lying, Denny," Brian said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "I know because you haven't spoken about a single song in months. You only talk about him." The line went dead, and Dennis stared at the phone in his hand, the dial tone droning like an accusation. He knew he was losing himself, but he didn't know how to stop the slide. The mansion at 14400 Sunset Boulevard was no longer his home. It was a mausoleum of his own good intentions, with Charlie Manson as the mad conductor of a funeral march that Dennis's own fear had orchestrated. The money began to run out, a trickle that became a roaring hemorrhage. His manager, a weasel-eyed man named Bob, started showing up at ungodly hours, waving bank statements in Dennis's face as he sat squinting against the headache that never left him. "You're bleeding cash, Denny," Bob said, jabbing a finger at a line of figure about Mount Kilimanjaro. "Recording studio? Fine. Pool maintenance? Okay. But who the hell is Terry, and why does he have a family credit card?" Dennis would snatch the papers, his eyes glossing over the numbers, unable to connect the dots of his spending to the faces that wandered his halls. He saw a group of girls wearing his expensive leather jackets, their mouths smeared with the remnants of ketchup from his gourmet kitchen, hopping into his custom Ferrari, a vehicle he hadn't driven himself in weeks. The engine roared, gravel spat from the tyres, and his heart screamed at him to run out and stop them, to reclaim his own property. "That's new, Dennis," Charlie croaked, his sticky unwashed hair hanging in strings. "Heard it in a dream." "You think you could help me get it on tape?" Tell the boys to put a beat to it." Dennis, staring at the empty space in the driveway where his car once was, nodded weakly. "Yeah, Charlie, sure, we can do that." He watched Charlie's cracked lips stretch into a smile, and he had never felt more powerless in his life. He was paying to be a passenger in his own destruction, and the price was not just his inheritance, but the very core of his being. The producers at Brother Records began to notice. One afternoon, a stoic, flinty-eyed executive named Hugo arrived unannounced, ostensibly to listen to new demos. Dennis, high on speed and sleeplessness, tried to corral the 20 or so guests into the music room, but they drifted aimlessly, some whispering to themselves, others staring blankly at the walls. Hugo sat at the grand piano, his fingers running over the keys, and asked Dennis to play him the future of the Beach Boys. Dennis's hands hovered over the drum kit, the itch to perform and the hatred of his own inability clashing in his gut. He picked up a mallet, tapped a rim shot, and then froze. No melody, no rhythm, nothing but a hollow echo in his mind. "We have an album due, Dennis," Hugo said, his voice flat. "We have a legacy to protect. If you can't produce, we need to know now." Dennis looked at the chaotic scene around him, the smell of stale pot smoke and desperate bodies thick in the air, and for the briefest flash, he saw himself floating through the ceiling, watching this grotesque puppet show below. "I got a vault of tunes, man. Just need a little more time to polish the edges." The facade of the rock star was cracking, and all the weed and pills in the world could not patch the fracture. One evening, as the sun bled into the ocean, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges, Dennis found himself alone on his balcony for the first time in weeks. The sea air, salty and biting, stung his face, a reminder of the youth he could once known, the surfer boy who had ridden waves with reckless abandon. Below, in the courtyard, he watched the Manson women, the ones he had once lusted after, huddled in a circle, their heads bowed, chanting something soft yet sinister. He strained to hear the words, but they dissolved into the incoming tide, leaving only a chill in his spine. He thought of his daughter Jennifer, with her innocent eyes, and for the first time a hot wave of fierce, paternal revulsion washed over him. He had brought her around these people. He had let these vampires into the world he was supposed to protect. The disgust was so visceral, so overwhelming, that he had to grip the railing to steady himself, his knuckles white with exertion. He wanted to vomit, to purge the poison that had been flowing through his veins for half a year. He took a deep breath, the salt air filling his lungs with a clarity he hadn't felt in months, and he walked back inside, determined to end it. Dennis stood in the doorway, arms crossed, and spat the words out. "Charlie, it's time to go. Get your people, and get the hell out of my house now." He expected a fight, a confrontation, a debate, but Charlie just looked up at him with those deep, unnerving eyes, a flicker of amusement passing through them. "You don't mean that, Denny," he said softly, so calmly it was chilling. "You're the one who invited us. You're the one who needs us. Who else is going to love you without the music?" The words were a blade, sliding between his ribs so smoothly that it took a second for the pain to register. Love without the music, the core of his deepest, most pathetic fear. The room was silent, every eye upon him, and his constructed resolve crumbled like a sandcastle against a wave. He looked at their hungry, waiting faces, and the need to be wanted, to be adored, clawed its way back up his throat. He realized then that he was not their master. He was their host, their provider, their willing blood donor, and the transfusion was turning him into a ghost. And he knew, with a prophetic certainty that chilled his very soul, that this moment of weakness, this failure to draw the line, would be the one he would replay in the darkest hours of his life, the moment he had the chance to save himself and didn't take it.